Well, I'm wondering, David, if you might just begin by telling us some of the concerns that actually led you to begin the Safe and Together program.
You know, really what was happening was I was working closely with child welfare, and what I was finding is that they were struggling with identifying how domestic violence perpetrators were harming kids.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the conversations I was having with them, all they could relate back to me was his arrest record or how many times they had verified maltreatments.
Mm-hmm.
And we found that it was really hard to do case planning around the perpetrator and behavior change if they couldn't describe his pattern of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So that part came really forward around the model, which was really needing to describe the perpetrator's pattern. And the part around the victim's strengths and all the different parts related to that, people were often making assumptions that if she was still in the relationship, she was there because she didn't understand the domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
And we started having discussions about her strengths, and we started having discussions about her abilities to protect. And really what became clear is folks really didn't know all the things she was probably already doing to keep the kids safe. So there was a whole organic process where I really worked side by side with safety officers in the US around their involvement with families. And so really it developed fairly organically from my work with child welfare particularly.
Mm. It seems like there's a number of innovations in your work, and one of them is the shifting of the focus from the so-called non-offending parent over to the perpetrator, and actually asking what the perpetrator does. And I found that really interesting. It seems to me that that's actually a major innovation in your work, is that you actually managed to switch the focus from how the non-offending parent is not protecting over to what the family is actually dealing with, what the dynamics are and that sort of thing. And I wonder if you can kind of elaborate on that a bit. And I think you actually call this pivoting, pivot from one to the other.
Part of it is child welfare, and I want to broaden it beyond sort of statutory workers to really the whole child welfare system, and really, in some ways, anybody who's working with families and working with children, this really applies to. So it even applies to family court and other sectors around that. And we have such a history, and I think Australia is very similar to the US, and I think the UK and Canada in this way as well, which is that the focus of child welfare has been very much on mothers. And there's been a challenge in that context to really deal with fathers in general, and to deal with violent fathers is another level beyond that. And so in the child welfare context, where the discussion's really been about the safety of kids, there's been a huge focus on women. And so when you add in that women are the majority of the domestic violence victims, there's really been an expectation that she's the one who's going to change the situation, even when the source of the danger to the kids is the perpetrator's behavior.
Yes, and clearly not her.
And clearly not the victim's behaviors and choices. And I think that's even by itself is very challenging, and even before you get to this idea of pivoting, and so which is a practice tool that we've developed to really refocus from the victim to the perpetrator. We really have to start with this idea that when domestic violence is a factor in the safety and well-being of kids, it's derived 100% from the behavior of the perpetrator and not from the decisions of the victim. And the way I like to say that is it's really that statement's made with a full stop at the end. No caveats, no parentheses. It's really that clear and that simple in that way.
David, you emphasise the need for detailing the behaviours, and you talk about that as the set of facts that can help the child protection, or the protection of children in a number of ways, including in not just the child protection investigation, but the importance of those facts when it comes to running a case in the courts. So can you talk a little bit about, some examples of what you mean by the level of detail that's required in documenting and where that should be documented?
Domestic violence is a behavioral profile at its heart. And so when we talk about domestic violence, it's really about describing the perpetrator's behaviors. That's what defines domestic violence. And when we're looking at the issue of domestic violence in children, we particularly need to have a real pattern-based focus on the issue, which means that we have to look at not only this person's behavior in this relationship, but across relationships, and the ways that they involve the children directly or indirectly in their behavior, both towards the adult, but maybe independently towards the child as well. So you have domestic violence perpetrators who are making mom's world smaller, which is making the kid's world smaller. Or they're also they're calling her names in front of the kids. And that's a parenting choice, and that's really something we need to include in our understanding of his pattern. Or he's also physically abusing the kids. And so all these things are part of when you have a pattern-based focus on the issue of domestic violence, that these are all things that we need to be talking about, assessing for, and then documenting in case records in a way that makes sense and makes it as useful as possible. So sometimes this stuff gets documented in one page here, another page here, and really the power of it is to bring it together and tell a story. This is this person's pattern of behavior, and this is what it's done to the family functioning. And that's what we're shooting for.
Yeah. In the domestic violence sector, we've talked a lot about, for a number of years, that domestic violence is a choice. You know, it's the perpetrator's choice to use violence, but you have also taken that to the next step, and it's actually a parenting choice.
That's
I
right.
was really interested
That's
in
right.
that concept, and I think it's a really important
Right.
one. So can you tell us a bit more about that?
It's really about this moving from an understanding of domestic violence as being something that happens between adults and a relationship-based understanding to, again, this pattern understanding, which means we need to think about perpetrators as parents, which really requires, I mean, the challenge, I think the big paradigm shift, or one of the big paradigm shifts, is underlying the model. And where we need to go is we need to think about fathers as parents more clearly and set high expectations, because it's really hard to hold a perpetrator accountable for when he calls his girlfriend or his wife names in front of the kids, to really make that more than he's abusing her, but he's actually choosing as a parent to emotionally abuse the kids or emotionally neglect the kids. And to get there, you have to really start thinking about, how am I thinking about dads or men as fathers? And really the role they play in families. And so to get to that is a parenting choice. You really need to see him as someone who's got responsibility for the kids, equally with her, and that he's responsible for creating the emotional environment. I think in many of the ways we approach families, we really give primary responsibility for creating the emotional environment for kids to the mother. And so therefore his role in disrupting it kind of gets minimized. And then she gets pushed forward as kind of to protect or keeping the kids safe. And in the States, for sure, we've seen that really put into language in statutes and other places.
That's almost a cultural shift, isn't it? Because there's such emphasis in this culture on mothers and
That's
so
right.
little
That's right.
on fathers.
I think you're right, and I think what we've seen is, and this is really not fair to mothers and fathers, is that we've really underplayed the importance fathers play and the influence they have on families, good and bad. There's some men who are really wonderful fathers, and they often report that they struggle to be taken seriously. I was just talking to a colleague, and she said that she's got a good friend who's a father, and she says that the doctor's office, even though he's the one that takes the kid to the doctor all the time, treats him as sort of a pats him on the head, as sort of, isn't that sweet, you're bringing your kid to the doctor, when it's really his job as a parent. So we miss out on that, but we also really miss out on the influence fathers have to be harmful.
Yes.
And the data really is pretty clear that around dads, they can have a powerful impact, and it's not on the amount of hours they spend in the family, but the quality of their interaction with their family that really impacts kids' outcomes. You know, paternal warmth is connected to good outcomes for kids, not how much time dad spends with the kids. So we really need to think about this role fathers play, and that they're very influential. And it is very hard when we're used to going in and asking the mother, well, are the kids medically up to date? You know, did you get the kids to counseling? And acting like, even though she may be married and there may be two parents, that she's the one who's got sole responsibility for those things.
It would be interesting to have a culture where we put the same expectations on boys, that they will provide the same level of support and care and all of these things in a family that girls are routinely expected to provide. I think we would not recognize ourselves if
it would be very different.
We seem to be a long way away from that kind of gender equality. And that reminds me of one of the issues that's frequently raised when we have these discussions is about women's violence towards men. What's your experience of, you know, families where police might go out to investigate, or family services and child protection services, and there's also evidence that she's been violent. So can you tell us a bit about your experience with that?
The way I approach this is, I think both men and women can be violent, and both men and women can be controlling. I don't think that's open to debate. I think in practice, when we look at the families we're working with, And we use, one of the nice things about the Safe and Together model, because it's a fact-based approach and it's a behavior-based approach, it provides a methodology to look at those circumstances where both the mother and father have been arrested for being violent, saying, what's both of their patterns of course of control and actions taken to harm the children. So I'm not afraid of circumstances where people bring us cases where they say both people have been arrested. I'll ask the same question about both people's patterns, because that's the objective lens to look at the case. But what we find in practice is almost always it's going to be the male who's engaging in that pattern of course of control and actions taken to harm the kids, and that the woman's violence is often reactive, it's self-defense. And that doesn't mean that from a child perspective there isn't a trauma that might be associated with her use of violence. I don't want to take that away. But it really, when we're looking at child safety from an objective point of view, there are very different roles that they're both playing.
That's also I think it also comes back to the issue of a parenting choice, because the perpetrator's choice or father's choice to use violence has then prompted a violent reaction from the children's mother. So it's another way in which the perpetrator of domestic violence is making a poor parenting choice as well.
You know, I was in Florida, I was doing some work and I was presented with a case and they said, well, both mom and dad are violent. And I basically used this behavior fact-based methodology and said, tell me about both people's patterns of behavior. And the worker who was on the phone said, well, and he started with dad, said, well, dad has threatened me and my supervisor with a weapon. He's gang involved. He's been physically assaulted to mom multiple times. He abandoned the family when mom had a car accident and there was young children. I watched him threaten mom in my presence and say, I'm going to disrupt your case plan. He said he sat on the arm of the couch, pointed at her, sat between me and her, and said, I'm going to destroy your case plan. This is how I'm going to do it. And so that's what he presented to us as part of his pattern. And then I said, okay, now tell me about mom's pattern of course control and actions taken to harm the kids. Exactly the same question. And what he said was, well, mom, when dad came over to take the license plate off the car, mom came out and jumped on his back to stop him. I said, okay, that's probably very scary for a kid to see. What else did she do? She threatened to take him to court for child support. I said, is that her legal right? He says, yes, but she threatened him. And I said, what else has she done? His next response was, well, I'm sure she's done more, but I don't know what it is. And I said, well, based on the facts, tell me what you know, because you've offered this conclusion that they're both violent. Explain to me what in her behavior is making you believe she's violent. And he couldn't come up with more. And that's just an example of using that methodology to kind of sort through a presentation that they're both violent, because as you hear that, you really get it that they're impacting the children very differently.
Actually, that's one thing I like about pivoting, because again, we often misread the mother and the actions the mother's taking that are in fact protected. But you say that we misread them as often in judgmental ways and often as being non-protective. So I'm wondering, could you also talk about that as well? How do we misread mothers by not taking the pattern of violence into account?
I mean, it's really hard to give a context for her decision-making without being able to articulate his pattern of behavior. And it's really, Heather, going back to your question about the level of detail, that we can't really just say there's a history of domestic violence. We have to be able to say, this is what the perpetrators engaged in, and we have to get down to the level of what's the nature of the threats, what's the level of violence, what might be the things they've done to be controlling, because without that information, her decision-making can really look skewed. In fact, dangerous or naive or any number of things. And so it's really important. I tell this story in training, which is of a family where part of his abuse was to destroy the kids' school supplies and sports equipment. And they were living together, planning to separate, but the attorneys told them to stay in the house together. So they were living in the same house together. And so to protect the kids' stuff, she would she'd take it into the room and lock the room at night, and she would sleep with it in the room. Well, he took that as an excuse to go to court, or use it to go to court and say, look at her, she's crazy, she sleeps with the kids' stuff. And so that behavior can be pathologized unless you can step back and say, well, look at his behavior pattern. Her actually efforts are protective of the kids' needs and situation.
And you give some other really interesting examples as well, like the mother who sends children away from the home quite frequently.
Right.
Because she knows that's protecting them.
That's right.
Can you elaborate on some more of this? Because I imagine that people watching this in the child protection
Right.
area regularly misread
Right.
families in this way.
Well, I gave an example earlier today, which is of a mother in a circumstance who didn't give her 8-year-old son her new cell phone number.
Mm.
And I think if you look at something like that in a vacuum, you go, there may be attachment issues she has. Why doesn't she understand the emergency, his need to reach her in emergency?
Mhm.
You can make a litany of things about how she's not being a good mother.
Mm.
But when you bring into focus that the father who was custodial, actually was out of the home but had primary custody, was telling this kid, Mom's stealing from me, Mom's stealing my keys. He was programming this kid to be a spy for him.
Mm.
And the caseworker actually had witnessed some of this behavior on part of the kid, kind of trying to challenge Mom's, looking at Mom's keys and saying, those are the ones Dad said you stole from him.
Mm.
That this mother now, you can put her decision not to give her son the cell phone number in context, because the son would be likely to give it to the father, and the father would use it to harass her.
Yeah, yeah.
And so without that information about his pattern, her decisions don't have a context.
Mm.
And without the context and without the ability to understand why she's making decisions, you're gonna have a harder time validating her strengths
Mm.
and partnering with her. Because if you think her
Yeah.
decisions don't make sense and are actually negative towards the child, then you're gonna approach her in a very negative, often
You're going to start
confrontational
seeing
way.
her as a sub-perpetrator.
That's
in a
right.
sense.
That's right, exactly. Or separate perpetrator, not even a separate perpetrator, but look, she has issues as well. Look, she's not really connected to this kid, she has attachment issues. We need to send her to treatment so she's better attached to her children.
Mm.
When really what she needs is a validation of
Mhm.
the impact he's having on the family and how hard she's working
Mm.
to still be there for her child
Yes.
and also keep herself safe.
So not only does that fail to
Mm.
prioritise safety of the children, but it also is a way of the system inadvertently colluding with the perpetrator. The perpetrator is able to manipulate the system
That's
to
right.
perpetrate
That's right.
further violence against
Yeah.
them.
Almost the perpetrator winds up looking like the better parent.
That's right. That's the
Mm.
absolute
Yeah.
danger, and that even in cases where we think of him as a bad parent, we really don't always have the skills to bring him back to sort of understand why she may be lying to us. And again, this came up today as we were doing training today, but really about oftentimes NGOs or statutory sector, they'll often be confronted with a victim who's saying, it didn't happen, I'm not seeing him.
Mm.
And then the focus of the frustration and even the decision to open a case or remove a kid starts hinging on, well, she lies to us, we can't trust her.
Yes, yeah.
Instead of it being focused on, is he continuing to be dangerous to the children? That's really the core issue in domestic violence, is a factor of child safety. It's the perpetrator's dangerousness.
Mm-hmm.
And we struggle with that because we can get fixated on, she's lying to us, we need her to tell us the truth, why won't she tell us the truth? We can't return our kids to her because we can't trust her. When we may very well know why she doesn't want to tell us the truth, that it's not safe. And we in fact can answer that question.
Yes, yeah.
I often ask workers, when they say, well, she's lying to me and I'm very frustrated by that, I'll say, well, what's your theory about why she's lying?
Mm.
And they'll say, well, I think she's lying because she's scared of us and she's scared of him.
Mm.
And I said, well, what's the method you can use to partner with somebody who's scared? And so we don't stop the attempt to partner just because she's lying. We really actually see it as possibly even a greater need to be better at partnering
Mm-hmm.
than even somebody who's more forthcoming.
Another one that occurs to me is substance abuse. A number of women that I've worked with have said basically that they started using substances so they could stay in a violent situation because they were so afraid for what would happen to their family if they didn't.
Right.
And
Or
again, I think
sometimes
we
it's
get
part of
often
the coercive
judgmental.
control, is about.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
addicting
Right.
the partner as well.
Right.
I've seen that as well.
Right. Well, there's a range of connections and pathways. Use with me, and if you don't use with me, I'm going to get abusive.
Yeah.
I keep them calm. I was working with a same-sex couple where, this is years ago, where the victim said to me, if I go out and buy liquor and I come home and then we drink on the couch, my partner falls asleep.
Yes, yes.
But if I don't do that and she goes out and uses, she starts drinking and she does cocaine and then she comes back and gets assaulted. So for her, the drinking together was part of the safety plan. You have that, you have the self-medicating and all those different things. And I think even in those cases, good practice dictates the ability to say to her, you know, we want to help you get sober. That's important for you and it's important for your children. And that still means that he's responsible 100% for his violence. That your use doesn't mean you're causing his violence. We can be that clear in the separation. And then we really need to look at, in his pattern, does he do things that are continuing to traumatize her? And does he have a pattern of sabotaging her recovery? What I find is people often can say, well, mom needs treatment. And we'll never stop to say, well, does he have a history of doing things that make it hard for her to complete treatment, like controlling the car so she can't get to AA meetings? Or if she needs to go inpatient when inpatient exists, will he do things at home that make her feel like she should be at home? I mean, extreme examples are things like harming animals or doing things or not taking care of pets. And so you have this thing, well, my choices are children, you know, that things, people and animals I care about are going to be harmed, so I better go home. We had one case where she was in a halfway house and he showed up, and he didn't get physically violent, but he showed up and demanded she leave. And so she left because of his history of violence. And what got documented, and I think this is a very important area where perpetrators' role gets made invisible, which is what got documented is she left the program against the advice of the program. And so she gets labeled as non-compliant. And I think we've seen that over and over again, that perpetrators' behaviors get made invisible. Now, I'm not saying she didn't need help around her addiction, and that we would need to work with her around that, but to label her as non-compliant, it really actually makes her pay for his behavior. And we see this over and over again in lots of different settings.
You gave an example today too about not only how the perpetrator behaviour might be made invisible but also minimised, and I'm thinking of the example of a child safety officer documenting that the mother had reported that he was mean to her, and when there was further exploration about what mean looked like, do you want to talk more about what the I guess it comes back to the importance of the detail and describing the behaviours, and not just saying he was mean.
Well, but I think we often, and I use the analogy today about competencies. When we look at competencies, whether we're working with perpetrators of men's behavior change program, or we're working inside child safety, or we're working in the NGO sector, that if we want to work with perpetrators, even when we want to work with victims, there's a certain level of comfort we need to have walking towards the violence and the specifics of the violence. And the analogy I made today was in 9/11, when everybody's running from the buildings, the firefighters are running towards the building. And so we need to have a comfort level when then somebody says, well, we argue a lot or gets really angry. We need to be able to say, for lots of reasons, we need to be able to say, so I don't misunderstand you or confuse what's going on in your family. Can you describe what you mean by he gets angry? What are the behaviors that he does to demonstrate to you that he's angry? What does he say? What does he do? And that really helps us, for instance, not pigeonhole and mislabel folks who are actually not abusive. It works in both directions. It clarifies the dangerousness that's there sometimes, but it also lets us move away from stereotypes and preconceptions. And it's particularly important when people have biases and assumptions that in the US, we'll think about people of color, poor men. There will be a lot of stereotypes and biases that are inaccurate, that they're more violent. And I think you really need to look at and say, when we ask these questions, we're level in the field. We're more likely to pick up on the affluent white man who's also very abusive, or and pick up on their abuse, and or not mislabel somebody who's maybe loud, who may be angry, but isn't really actually abusive or controlling. It's just people are intimidated by their demeanor, but they're actually not truly scared. So there's lots of values to that very specific kind of question. People say my partner's jealous, people say my partner's angry, actually doesn't give you the information you need to assess child safety. The next question is, what does your partner do to show you that they're jealous? How they demonstrate they're jealous? That gives you that level of detail that you're asking about. So,
I'm wondering if you were to give one piece of advice to child safety workers and one piece of advice to policymakers. I mean, they might be two different things, they
Right.
might be similar.
right.
What might they be? What would be, if
For-
one thing was to change?
For child safety workers, one thing would be that when you go out and meet with the domestic violence survivor, assume she's been safety planning for her children before you ever showed up. And that part of your job is to really to seek out and understand her efforts and to validate them. I like to say that we're 100% responsible for our practice in building bridges to victims. They make the choice to step onto those bridges, but this is something we can control, which is when you get a domestic violence case coming in, that you can approach that victim assuming whatever else you think is going on, that she's been putting efforts in to keep the kids safe. And that's going to be one of the ways to build a partnership with her around the safety of the kids. So that's really one of the critical things. And I think for policymakers, if we're looking at child safety in particular, is look at how your organization thinks and conceptualizes perpetrators and what kind of resources you develop to support staff doing a better job intervening with perpetrators. And that looks like a lot of different things. That's not just men's behavior change programs, but are you training staff to have the skills and the support to intervene with perpetrators, to talk to them in a safe and meaningful way? Do you train supervisors and guide them to expect workers to do that and are able to support them? It's really not right to wake up one day and say, well, now we're going to go start interviewing violent men. That isn't fair to the staff and isn't going to lead to good outcomes. You have to look at training.
Not very realistic, isn't
They're
it?
not very realistic, and people are going to resist it, balk at it, make poor decisions, increase danger. You really need to lay out a plan for training, supervision, checks for safety for the workers, how you're going to manage the information that comes back from that. I mean, it's a very thoughtful process, and policymakers need to approach it in a very thoughtful way, but that's really where they need to look and to weave that into father engagement efforts. I talked today about there's a real convergence. I think there's a real opportunity in this convergence that we want to look at families more holistically. We want to do a better job by men, and I think that's very important. And I think that doing a better job with men also allows us the opportunity to do a better job around domestic violence and by women and kids about men. And so you really need to approach it from this direction that's sort of very thoughtful around efforts.
Do you find perpetrators easy to engage with?
I think they're extremely challenging. I've probably worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of perpetrators who mostly were court mandated to come and see me when I ran a men's behavior change group in the US. And I think you can get better and it can get easier, but it's almost always hard and challenging. You have to really approach it very strategically. You have to understand how you can build rapport with them without colluding with them. And you really need to keep your eye on the fact that the intervention with them is about other people actually. That it's one of those programs where you're working with one person, but your real client in many ways is the women and the kids.
Yes, it's not that person.
It's not that person. You really have to understand that and know how to talk to him and build rapport and be genuine. And not get pulled into very powerful sometimes projections where he's saying she's the problem.
Yes, yeah.
And so there's lots of pieces to this. And one of the things I often say in communities is child welfare and other folks who are going to work with perpetrators should go to the men's behavior change programs and ask them to teach skills, not just talk about their program, but actually talk about how this is how you talk to men in a non-judgmental way without colluding with them. This is how we focus in our work on men's behavior and get men to talk about their kids in a healthy way. And to actually train into, let's say, child safety around these skills that men's behavior change programs are quite good at if they're a good program. And help those people integrate those skills into their own work. And to my mind, that's one way we can up the competencies in child safety around perpetrators.
So can I throw it at you?
Sure.
I think one of the ones that often frustrates people quite a lot is the person seems almost impenetrable
Mm-hmm.
in terms of will not admit that, will not own any part of the problem at all.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they are just in an unfortunate situation.
Right.
They have children who don't like them and obey them, and they have a wife who also doesn't, you know,
Right.
it's always everyone else's fault.
Right.
Sometimes,
Right.
I think David Adams called these narcissistic
Yeah.
characters.
Yeah.
I think if you could tell us 3 things we could do with a narcissistic person, we would be eternally grateful.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a magic wand. People asked me about that earlier today. I guess the place I start in those conversations is he acknowledging a reasonable percentage of his behaviors? And I make the distinction between acknowledging and taking responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Acknowledging is simply admitting I did that behavior, but then blaming it on other people. If somebody's not willing to even acknowledge the behaviors, then there's very little in my mind a men's behavior change program can do. I think we really need to be clear about that.
So we kind of have to triage.
That's right. I mean, and I've done assessments where people have been sent to me, and this really applies to child safety, is really to understand that if you go and meet with a man who's been arrested or been accused of being violent and has a long history, and you meet with him, he says, all of that's not true, I never did any of that. There's really very little you can do with him in terms of engagement. And I think that doesn't mean that we step away from trying to intervene with him, but the engagement piece of that intervention really, he's really kind of putting and that really you're looking at more kind of the coercive force of courts and other things to compel him to engage in things and engage in certain behaviors. But he's not engageable around the facts of the behavior. So that's very important to identify that and really see that as a hard line.
You've also made a distinction between acknowledging violence and taking responsibility for it or being accountable for it.
Right. And I think the difference is once somebody acknowledges and says, I did push her, but let me tell you why I needed to push her or why it wasn't my fault. That once you get to that point, you at least can try out certain things. And part of the work with perpetrators is trying out certain engagement strategies to see what they're willing to do and how they're going to respond. So with a man who says, yes, I pushed her, but you really need to understand why I did it or why it wasn't so bad, or really, there was a case that was shared where, he pushed her and it ended with an infant or a young kid breaking their leg being broken. And I think that's an example of he admitted to pushing his wife while she's holding the baby, but wouldn't take any responsibility for the outcome of it. And you really want to be able to start with this person and say, okay, you told me that you pushed her. And I'm really at this moment not want to talk about sort of why you think it was okay, why it wasn't a big deal. I want to ask you what that behavior means for you as a father. Does that fit with, if you're pushing a child's mother in front of the kids,
or holding a kid,
or while she's holding a kid, how do you understand it as being part of your understanding of being a good dad? And so you really want to confront him with his contradictions. You want to confront him with his own attitudes.
What you're doing is you're contextualizing his actions in the context of being a dad.
That's right, and asking him to gauge the question, and really then again he gets to decide whether he engages it or not. And even that engagement, even if he says, I really actually, now that you're asking me it this way, it really upsets me. And we've seen perpetrators in that circumstance in child safety start crying and breaking down, and the advice I give to child safety in that circumstance is that admission or acknowledgement and then possibly a statement of responsibility, I was wrong, I did it, is only the starting point for a behavior change process. People are so low in their expectations of these guys that they often go, oh my God, he was crying and he said he was sorry and it was so wrong, and they don't really see that that's actually the beginning of the process of working with them to say, okay, given that this is upsetting you, given that you understand it's bad for your children, now what are you going to commit to that's going to make a real difference in the lives of your children? And I think people are often challenged that the work with perpetrators, whether it's in men's behavior change, is slow, or it's even child safety. It's slow and it's not very linear. Even if he's serious about wanting to be different, it's very hard and it takes time. And I think it's very challenging for people in a lot of different ways.
David, I just want to clarify here that when you're talking about this father's poor parenting choices, it's not, domestic violence as an indicator of poor parenting choice. It's not to diminish the seriousness of domestic violence and the fact that it's causing harm to the mother.
No, not at all.
But it's
It's
about
also a poor
saying that
partnering choice.
it's shifting. I mean, it's not minimising that or diminishing that in
Right.
any way, but making it child-centred. This is about a way of bringing the child into the centre of the...
It's not about taking anything away, it's about expanded understanding of the perpetrator's impact on the family. So one way to think about it is, say, if he makes her world smaller, he's making the kid's world smaller oftentimes. So I don't want to leave out her and the impact on her at all, and I don't want to push it to the background even. I really want to understand and talk about what is it like for your kids when you call their mother names or you hurt their mother. And that's about engaging him as a parent.
Yes.
And it's, on one level, it's very practical because we have a sense that if men are going to be motivated to change, that one of the best pathways to reach them is around their kids. And that shouldn't surprise us, because that actually doesn't make them very different from women or men around other issues, why people stop smoking.
And we have research that shows that,
That's
in
right.
fact, from Western Australia,
That's right.
Freedom from Fear.
Which I'm very familiar,
Yeah.
from that Freedom from Fear campaign is very, if people aren't familiar with it, they really looked at men and what mattered the most, and what mattered to them more than you're going to go to jail, or people are going to be unhappy with you, or you're going to lose your partner, was that you're going to harm your kids.
Yeah.
And that was groundbreaking sort of social marketing, and it got men to call and ask for help,
Yes.
just based on seeing a billboard and advertisements. And it's actually one of the things that inspired me to kind of keep moving forward down this road was really that social marketing campaign. But in this way, these men are not any different than any other parent. And we should make that clear, because I think it's easy to say, wow, why should they have to be worried about their kids to change? And the truth is, people lose weight, people stop smoking, they stop drinking because they want to be there for their kids in old age. So it's, so this is not any different in terms of that way. So I don't want to minimize the impact he's having on her. I don't want to diminish the seriousness of it. And part of what we can say to men is, what kind of mother do you want your kids to have? Do you want them to have a strong mother? Do you want them to have a strong relationship with their mother? And so you're really kind of also really directly weaving in his respect for her into his understanding of being a parent. And that's really the approach we've taken even in work with fatherhood programs, which is the definition of being a good father really should include working well in partnership with the children's mother, whether they're together or not. And so this is how it really connects to some of the other work we're doing that are just with fathers in general.
It's also about supporting your children's attachments
That's right.
as well, and modeling good attachment for them, so that when they grow up as adults, they don't make the same kind of parenting choices.
That's right. So I think what's interesting is, out of the Australian longitudinal study on children, is there's real data from the Australian context about kids' outcomes, good outcomes for kids being tied to the close relationship between fathers and their partners and the mothers of their children. So we really have, and I've seen data like that out of the US and other places, which really, that in our definition of good fathering, this, if a man's interested in good outcomes for his kids, that we're in a reasonable position to say to him, the way you treat the kid's mother is critical to your children having a good outcome. I think that's a reasonable statement to make, and to really, and again, without negating the importance of treating her with respect just for the sake of her being a person, that really to kind of leverage is what you hope is his commitment to his kids, to really promote better behavior all the way around with the family. And so that's just something that's out of the Australian context I think is very relevant.
So one of the challenges, I guess, in moving forward on improved practice around safety for women and their children is that we have, over the last 30, 40 years in this country and others, developed two different sectors. And, we've seen some positive signs of those two sectors being able to come together. And you talked about convergence earlier. So, how are we going to achieve that? What are some of the insights that you might have for us from your work in the United States around how we can support the convergence of, a new way of doing this work, so we don't have two distinct sectors trying to collaborate, but rather a more integrated systems approach.
You know, one of the things I believe I'm most proud about around the Safer Together model is the way it's been able to help bridge the gap between the domestic violence sector and child safety in the US, and really I've seen it travel well to the UK and Scotland, and now it feels like here the conversation we've been able to have feel very promising, that this focus on perpetrators provides an ability to bring together the domestic violence sector and the child safety sector to work more collaboratively around the safety of women and kids. What's happened before, I think, in many cases is, and these are two sectors that have very honorable missions and goals and intents, and they really are working towards the safety of families.
Yes.
But often what's been troubling is that when you're looking at this from a coming together point of view, women's sector folks are very good at talking about the impact the violence is having on women and kids, the barriers they face to leaving, the services need. They're very good at providing support. But in that, what's finally happening is that the perpetrator's behaviors, and actually the perpetrator can even become invisible in the way that gets talked about from the domestic violence sector. And then you bring them together with child safety, where they've historically been focused on mothers, and then the conversation becomes about the moms and what the moms should be doing. And that's where we've seen a lot of tension, which is people really kind of focusing together, colluding actually the domestic violence sector and the child safety sector, and in focusing on the mothers exclusively, and actually making the perpetrators invisible. And what we're really pleased about is when you bring the perpetrators' responsibility to focus and say they're 100% responsible, immediately the domestic violence sector says, yes, that's right. That's what we've been saying. This is the way we need to look at it. Child safety, you're giving them a tool to focus on child safety in a fact-based way. And then that gives an opportunity for child safety to have a much more constructive partnership with her, because they see her as their ally in the safety of the kids. Yeah. And so this kind of approach, especially when to be honest, when child welfare takes the lead, we've seen great results, because I believe as a statutory, as the government, that has had a history of being destructive to domestic violence victims, and we talk about domestic violence, destructive child welfare practice, because there is that history, that I do think child welfare has a proactive responsibility to say, we want to do this differently, we want to change our practice, and to reach out to the domestic violence sector and say, we're committed to doing a better job intervening with perpetrators, not blaming victims for perpetrators' behavior, and working more collaboratively with victims and with their advocates. And what we've seen in Florida and other places when child welfare has taken that step, that domestic violence advocates really run towards them, really literally, and try to embrace a partnership with them. We've seen, I've been on panels where we've done Safer Together work, where the advocates and the child welfare workers say, well, we used to fight, these panels used to be much more interesting than they're going to be today, because we used to fight all the time, and now we pretty much agree, and not that we agree on everything, but we trust each other more. And advocates say, I know I can call up the child safety manager and ask them a question.
And it's safe to have a different opinion.
And it's safe to have a different opinion, and it's safe, and we understand where we're coming from. And like we saw today, that there's ways to even talk about situations where the kids still may be in danger from the perpetrator, and the kids may not even be able to return home, but when it's explained as the kids can't return home because of the perpetrator's violence, not because of the failure to protect the victim, and we can make the perpetrator's violence really clear, that at least today what we saw is the women's sector says, well, that makes sense to us.
Yes. Yes.
And so we've seen this in Ohio in the States, we've seen this in Florida, we've seen this in lots of other places where the model is really effectively implemented, that it really allows for greater collaboration between the domestic violence sector and the child welfare sector. And it feels better to both sectors and their mission, and they really can approach each other with integrity and respect and an appreciation. So to be honest, that's one result of the model that I feel most proud about, is it creates a way for them to come together and work for families more effectively.
Well, we're in a very exciting period of time in our history in Queensland in particular. We do have, at a national level, we've got the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children. It's already resulted in some very positive law reform, and particularly in the family law area. We've recently had the Carmody Commission of Inquiry, and And what we saw in the workshop today, as you referred to, is the preparedness to shift in terms of practice and ways of thinking and doing. It's a really exciting opportunity, and it's just been an absolute privilege to have you here in our country and contributing to the development of this practice and the opportunity to grasp this, and really run with this opportunity. And Ron, I wanted to thank you too for participating in the conversation. It's been a great pleasure to join with both of you in having this, I think, a really important discussion. And I'm hoping that this will be a useful source of information for practitioners in domestic violence and child protection into the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you.